The lights in the corridor flickered like a dying star, which was appropriate considering Dr. Alistair Thorne felt about as lively as a breakfast served on Alpha Centauri's cheapest orbital diner. He squinted at the buzzing fixtures above, half expecting them to finally sputter out and leave him in total darkness. That would be just his luck. "I swear, the universe has it out for me today," he muttered, kicking a stray bolt down the narrow passage of what was optimistically labeled as Silent Echo Research Base. Silent Echo wasn't much to look at, nestled inside an asteroid that probably wished it had been left alone to its cosmic solitude. The base was a patchwork of metal and misery, with walls that whispered secrets if you listened too close and floors that complained loudly with every footstep. A perfect hideaway, really, if you had a thing for oppressive silence and the ever-present threat of a slow, oxygen-less death. Thorne's boots scuffed along the grated floor, his mind running through the usual list of grievances. The coffee was atrocious, the air recycled one too many times, and now this a message waiting in his quarters, blinking insistently like an annoying neighbor who just wouldn't take the hint. Probably another damn report, he sighed, pushing open the door to his compartment. Inside, his sanctuary was as Spartan as the rest of the facility. A bed that could double as an ironing board, a desk cluttered with datapads displaying more red than should be considered healthy, and a tiny terminal that beeped ominously. He punched the terminal's keys with the precision of a man who'd spent far too many years making friends with irritable machinery. The message unfolded on the screen, its words stark and unfriendly. "Confidential, Dr. Alistair Thorne, you have been identified as a key witness in the upcoming Galactic Tribunal. Your presence is required to testify on matters concerning." Thorne stopped reading. His eyebrows rose so high they almost detached and floated off into the nether regions of his prematurely receding hairline. A tribunal. What did I do this time? He hissed to the empty room, half expecting it to chuckle back with an answer. But there was no punchline coming from the walls today. Clearing his throat, Thorne read on, his stomach tying itself into knots. The message rambled about responsibilities, duty, and the kind of honor that only came with a very large target painted on your back. "Testify, huh? Well, at least it's not another audit," he said dryly, though no one was around to share in the joke. The Galactic Tribunal was the kind of circus where the clowns wore formal uniforms and the stakes were more than just your pride. It was the grand theater of cosmic justice, where decisions were made that could turn planets into footnotes. And they wanted him to star in the latest production. He let out a huff, pacing the room as if dodging invisible grenades of anxiety. "Silent Echo, my arse," he muttered. More like screaming bloody obvious. The realization hit him he'd have to leave this desolate rock, meet people, testify in front of those who might not care if he was blasted to atoms afterward. Isn't life just a bundle of joy? He quipped to the universe, which remained predictably silent in its response. A knock on the door broke through his spiraling thoughts. Thorne's eyes darted to the entrance. "Enter if you dare," he called out. The door slid open, revealing a figure wrapped in a uniform so crisp it might have once been a sheet of steel. Lieutenant Rada Iverson, the base's security chief, had the look of someone who hadn't bothered with sleep since the last solar flare. "Heard the news?" Iverson asked, arms crossed like she could squeeze an answer out of the atmosphere. Thorne shrugged, attempting casualness and failing spectacularly. "You mean about my sudden promotion to Galactic Scapegoat?" "Yeah, just got the memo." Iverson's smile was more a quick twitch of the lips than any expression of joy. "Congrats. Must be a proud moment, eh? Like winning the lottery and finding out it's in Monopoly money," Thorne replied, gesturing to the terminal. "What do you make of it?" She stepped inside, glancing at the screen with practiced indifference. "Means you're either in deep trouble or about to be. Either way, you're getting off this rock. You sound almost jealous, envious maybe. You get to leave this rust bucket. I get to stay and play babysitter to scientists who think they're gods." Thorne chuckled, a rare sound that echoed oddly in the small room. God complex is just part of the job description. Comes right after must enjoy long walks on barren asteroids. Iverson allowed herself a brief grin. So, when do you ship out? That's the kicker. No date, just a mandate. Guess someone will come knocking when they're ready to drag me off. She gave him a sidelong glance. Watch your back, Thorn. Tribunal doesn't call people for a chat over tea. Tea's overrated anyway. But I'll keep it in mind. Thanks for the heads up, you'd better, she said, turning to leave. And try not to die before you get off this rock. It's a pain in the ass to fill out the paperwork. I'll do my best, Thorn replied, watching her exit. Alone again, he leaned against the desk, staring at the message that had so neatly upheaved his life. He sighed, a long, weary sound that carried all the weight of someone who'd seen too much and still didn't have a damn clue what was coming next. A trial, a tribunal, and probably a funeral, he mused. All in a day's work. The terminal beeped again, a curt reminder of its presence. Thorn resisted the urge to smash it barely. Instead, he shut it down with a flick of a switch, plunging the room into blessedly untouched silence. In the dim light, he let himself imagine what it would be like to testify in front of the galaxy's finest. Probably a lot like getting a root canal while reciting Shakespeare. To be or not to be. Fried by a plasma burst, he murmured. His escape from silent echo, if it could even be called that, loomed large in his mind. The galaxy beyond was a mess of politics and power plays, and here he was, about to dive headfirst into the deep end with concrete shoes. But there was no running from it. The wheels had been set in motion, and if there was one thing Thorn knew, it was that trying to stop galactic bureaucracy was like trying to hold back a supernova with a paper fan. Futile, ridiculous, and likely to end in tears. For now, all he could do was wait. Wait and wonder what the hell he'd gotten himself into. As he settled into the stiff embrace of his bunk, Thorn couldn't help but chuckle into the darkness. Here's to hoping the galaxy's ready for a bit of thorn-flavored chaos. The bass hummed around him, a mechanical lullaby that did little to calm his racing thoughts. Somewhere beyond the asteroid's stony exterior, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas playing out below. And as sleep finally claimed him, Thorn's last thought was a simple, sardonic prayer to whatever cosmic force might be listening. Please, don't let me screw this up. The sound of his terminal beeped again, like a persistent mosquito buzzing around his ear. Doctor, Alistair Thorn groaned and pulled himself out of the stiff bunk that had somehow convinced him it was a bed. What now? He muttered, slapping the terminal's keys with the grace of a drunken octopus. On the screen, just beneath the ominous tribunal notice, another message waited, its header as friendly as a tax audit. Urgent, security breach detected. Fantastic. Just what I needed to spice up my life, he grumbled. Maybe the walls really were listening and decided he needed more excitement. Doctor. Thorn, a voice came from the doorway, slick as oil and twice as hard to wash off. Thorn turned, expecting to see Iverson again, but instead found himself face to face with a figure that seemed to have all the warmth of a space vacuum. Tall and cloaked in a uniform that was unsettlingly plain, the individual had skin that shimmered like polished marble and eyes that glinted with too much intelligence. "And you are?" Thorn asked, crossing his arms in a futile attempt to appear more in control than he felt. "Zyra," the figure replied, each syllable clipped like they were on a schedule. "I've been sent to assist you," Thorn blinked. "Assist? With what exactly?" "My imminent trip to the Galactic Tribunal's circus of fun." Zyra's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "You might say that. There are those who would prefer your testimony never reaches the tribunal. You're saying someone wants to kill me," Thorn feigned shock. "I must be more important than I thought." "Not kill," Zyra corrected, with the kind of assurance that only comes from knowing entirely too much. "Not yet. Sabotage. Discredit. Ensure what you know never sees the sterile light of a tribunal's halls." "Well, that's reassuring," Thorn replied dryly. "And here I thought the biggest threat was dying of boredom on this rock." Zyra stepped further into the room, emotion fluid and precise. I have a proposal. We delve into the archives of this base. Find out who's behind this and expose them before you're called to testify. You make it sound so easy, like fixing the coffee machine in the break room, which, by the way, is beyond salvation. Consider the alternative, Zyra said. You leave here without answers, without protection, and walk straight into a trap. Thorn rubbed his temples, trying to fight off the sense of impending doom creeping up his spine. All right. Let's do it. But if they kill me, I'm haunting your ass. Deal, Zyra said, their expression unchanging. Thorn didn't trust easily, especially not anyone who looked like they'd been assembled in some high-end genetics lab. But Zyra seemed to know more about the situation than he did, which, admittedly, wasn't hard. They moved through the corridors together, the silent echoes of the base their only companions. Thorn couldn't help but notice the way Zyra's presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was both unsettling and oddly reassuring, like having a trained predator on your side. So, Thorn said, as they approached the base's archive room, who's pulling the strings behind this little plot of betrayal? That's what we're here to find out, Zyra replied, keying in a code with the kind of casual authority that made Thorn wonder exactly how many rules they were breaking. The door slid open with a whoosh that sounded unnervingly final. Inside, the archive room was a labyrinth of outdated technology, each terminal and console a relic from a time when design aesthetics were clearly an afterthought. Welcome to the future, Thorn muttered, eyeing the rows of humming machines, where everything's made of rust and regret. Zyra moved with purpose, navigating the room like they had done this 1,000 times before. They stopped at a terminal buried under a layer of dust and started typing with precision. Let me guess, Thorn said, leaning against a nearby console. You moonlight as a hacker in your spare time. Zyra's eyes didn't leave the screen. You could say it's a hobby. That's comforting, Thorn replied. Most people knit or collect stamps. Here it is, Zyra said, pointing to a string of data that looked like it had been written in a language only computers and the criminally insane could understand. Thorn squinted at the screen. What am I looking at? A series of encrypted communications, Zyra explained, originating from within the base and sent to locations uncomfortably close to some very influential sectors. Influential as in, let's quietly dispose of witnesses influential, precisely. Thorn scratched his chin, his brain working overtime to catch up with the unfolding conspiracy. Any idea who? Not yet. But we're getting closer, Zyra said. Their fingers danced over the keys, bringing up more data, more evidence that the silent echo wasn't as silent as it pretended to be. Thorn watched as lines of code and encrypted messages filled the screen. It was like staring into a swamp of technical jargon, but Zyra seemed to navigate it with ease. He couldn't help but feel a begrudging admiration for their skills. Or maybe it was just relief that someone else was doing the heavy lifting for once. So, hypothetically speaking, Thorn said as they worked, if we find who's behind this, what's the plan? Confront them with a sternly worded letter. Zyra glanced at him, a flicker of amusement in their eyes. Let's cross that bridge when we reach it. For now, we need more proof. Proof. Right, Thorn replied, nodding as if he had any idea how to obtain such a thing. And while we're at it, let's make sure we don't end up on the wrong side of an airlock. Agreed, Zyra said, their focus back on the screen. Silence settled over them, the hum of the archive room the only sound. Thorn's mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. It wasn't every day you discovered you were the unwitting star in a cosmic thriller, complete with spies, conspiracies, and a very real chance of ending up as cosmic dust. Why me? Thorn asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Why pick me as the key witness? I'm just a scientist, not important enough to warrant this kind of attention. Zyra paused, considering. Maybe they underestimated you. Or maybe you stumbled upon something bigger than you realized. Wouldn't be the first time I've stumbled into trouble, Thorn admitted. Then let's make sure it's not your last, Zyra said. Thorn chuckled, a humorless sound. That's the plan, isn't it? Survive, testify, and hopefully not get vaporized in the process. Precisely, Zyra agreed. They worked through the night, or whatever passed for night inside an asteroid, poring over the data until Thorne's eyes felt like they were about to fall out of his head. Evidence of transactions, encrypted coordinates, and cryptic messages scrolled past them, each revealing a growing picture of treachery and deceit. This, Thorne said, rubbing his tired eyes, is turning out to be one hell of a puzzle. And we're only just beginning, Zyra replied, their tone offering no comfort but plenty of resolve. Great, Thorne said, yawning. I always did love a challenge. You were in the wrong profession if you didn't, Zyra commented dryly. As they continued to dig deeper, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling they were teetering on the edge of something vast and dangerous. And while he wasn't entirely sure how they'd survive, he found it strangely exhilarating. Let's wrap this up for tonight, Zyra finally suggested. We'll hit a dead end if we don't rest. Thorne nodded, although he suspected sleep would be as elusive as ever. All right, but tomorrow we need to make a plan. If we find out who's behind this, I want a strategy that doesn't rely on my charm and wit alone. Zyra gave him a look that might have been a smile in a different universe. Agreed. Tomorrow, then. As they left the archive room, Thorne couldn't help but feel a little more alive. It was hard to remember the last time he felt like he was doing something that mattered, even if it did mean he was also a prime candidate for a premature funeral. Back in his quarters, he sank onto his bunk, the weight of the day pressing down on him. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of cosmic joke the universe was playing by casting him as the unwilling hero in this unfolding drama. Here's to not dying, he murmured to himself, closing his eyes, and maybe even making a difference. As sleep finally claimed him, the sound of the base's mechanical heartbeat filled the room. In the darkness, Thorne dreamed of shadows and secrets, knowing that when he woke, the real work would begin. The Silent Echo research base wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it had its own brand of charm, if you loved the idea of living in a metal coffin. Dr. Alistair Thorne decided that was too generous. It was more like a metal coffin that someone had filled with unsolvable puzzles and unpronounceable jargon. And now, it seemed, with people who wanted him out of the picture. Permanently. Waking up the next morning, Thorne found himself staring at the ceiling. He half expected it to cave in, given his luck. Instead, his terminal buzzed with the angry persistence of someone who hadn't been told that patience was a virtue, not a requirement. He tapped it and the screen flickered to life, displaying more messages flagged with the kind of urgency usually reserved for impending cosmic disasters. What fresh hell is this? Thorne muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He skimmed through the alerts, each one detailing a new and exciting way someone might attempt to discredit him. Wiretaps, data breaches, and something about unfortunate accidents during asteroid core samples. Thorne didn't have the time or the stomach to dwell on the implications. A knock on his door announced Zyra's arrival, or as Thorne privately called them, his assigned babysitter with a PhD in intimidation. "Morning," Zyra said as they entered, their demeanor as chilly as the base's recycled air. "Is it though?" Thorne replied, gesturing dramatically at his terminal. "Because this feels like the day from hell." Zyra scanned the messages, their expression unreadable. "Looks like they are escalating. We need to move faster." "No kidding." Thorne stood, feeling every vertebra crack in protest. "Got any bright ideas, or is this the part where we improvise and hope for the best?" Zyra's eyes locked onto his, too much knowledge in those steely orbs. "We can't rely on the base's systems. They're compromised. We need a physical backup of everything. Hard evidence." "You're suggesting we go analog," Thorne scoffed. "Might as well break out the typewriters and carrier pigeons while we're at it." Without missing a beat, Zyra replied, "If that's what it takes." Thorne sighed, already feeling the weight of what was coming. "All right, let's get retro. But if we're doing this, I want to know who we're up against." As if on cue, the lights flickered, casting the room into brief, unsettling darkness. Thorn froze, a creeping dread curling around his spine. Tell me that was just a power surge. Unlikely, Zyra said, their voice low and measured. It's a signal, someone's trying to flush us out. Great, Thorn groaned. First they want to kill me quietly, now they're sending me a damn invitation. Stay calm. We use this to our advantage, Zyra said, already moving towards the door. Thorn followed because what else was he going to do? They moved through the corridors with purpose, the oppressive silence pressing in on them like the weight of the asteroid above. Each step felt like it echoed through the entire base, as if announcing their presence to whatever malevolent forces lurked in the shadows. Where are we going? Thorn asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The control center, Zyra replied. We need to disable their surveillance, at least temporarily. I hope you have a plan that doesn't involve us getting spaced. Working on it, Zyra said, with a confidence that could have been reassuring if it wasn't for the circumstances. They rounded a corner only to find themselves face to face with a security droid. It hovered there, its sensors glowing with the pleasure of catching someone red-handed. Hello, officer, Thorn said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just out for a morning stroll. The droid emitted a series of beeps that translated to, unauthorized access detected. Please remain where you are. Zyra didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, they produced a device from their cloak and aimed it at the droid. The machine jittered, its sensors flickering in confusion before it powered down with a disappointing whir. Remind me to never get on your bad side, Thorn remarked, lowering his hands. Noted, Zyra said, stowing the device. They continued to the control center, finding it mercifully unoccupied. Zyra immediately set to work at the main console, fingers dancing over the controls with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this far longer than was legally advisable. Thorn paced behind them, nerves fraying with each passing second. What's the plan? Blow the place sky high and sort through the debris? Not quite, Zyra replied. We're going to create a diversion. Make them think we're somewhere else. Like a magic trick, but with less glitter and more potential for violent death. Something like that. Thorn watched as Zyra initiated a series of commands that made no sense to him, but apparently meant a lot to their unseen adversaries. Alarms blared, and lights flashed throughout the base, enough chaos to convince anyone that the base was under a full-scale assault. That should keep them busy, Zyra said, stepping back from the console. Now we gather what we need and get out. Where to? Zyra hesitated, something unspoken passing between them. The labs. There's a terminal there with an isolated network. We can secure the data we need without interference. Lead the way, Thorn said, hoping the labs were less occupied than the corridors. They navigated the chaos, the droid's earlier absence making more sense now. Whatever factions were pulling strings here, they weren't shy about playing dirty. And now, more than ever, Thorn realized just how high the stakes were. They reached the lab without incident, but as they entered, Thorn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was the kind of paranoia that made you check under the bed for monsters, only to find them standing right behind you. Zyra moved to a terminal, quickly accessing the isolated network. This should take a few minutes. Let's hope we have that long, Thorn said, glancing over his shoulder. Don't worry, Zyra assured, though Thorn noted the tension in their voice. We'll know if someone's coming. Thorn wasn't so sure. The base was a powder keg, and they were the unfortunate souls holding a match. He turned his attention to the lab's equipment. It was a mess of devices and prototypes, none of which Thorn had ever seen. He picked up a small, spherical object that hummed softly in his hand. What's this? He asked, holding it up. Careful, Zyra warned, glancing at the object. That's a prototype. It's supposed to disrupt electromagnetic fields. Supposed to? Thorn echoed with a grimace. Because there's nothing quite like testing experimental tech during a crisis. As if on cue, the alarms changed their tune, signaling a breach in the lab's entry. Thorn's heart skipped, and he shoved the device into his pocket, hands instinctively reaching for something that resembled a weapon. Zyra tensed, their hand hovering over their sidearm. Stay alert, Thorn didn't need to be told twice. He felt the cold sweat trickling down his spine as the lab door rattled, barely holding against whatever was trying to tear it down. "So, what now?" Thorn asked, voice barely above a whisper. "We hold our ground," Zyra replied, "and hope we finish before they get through." "Sounds like a plan," Thorn muttered. A terrible, suicidal plan. The door buckled, and Thorn steeled himself, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he stood his ground because right now there wasn't anywhere else to go. He glanced at Zyra, who was focused, their fingers flying across the terminal keys with an urgency that matched the pounding of Thorn's heart. "Almost there," Zyra murmured, more to themselves than anyone else. The door finally gave way, crashing open with a metallic clang that echoed through the lab. Thorn braced, eyes darting to see who or what was about to burst through. But instead of a squad of armed goons, a single figure stepped in, someone Thorn had never seen before, yet somehow felt strangely familiar. An older man with a grin like a snake that just ate a particularly juicy rat. "Dr. Thorn," the man drawled, his voice like oil on water. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Thorn's brain scrambled to place the face, the voice, but came up empty. "Wish I could say the same," he shot back. "You're here to kill me or just chat?" The man chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Neither. I'm here to make sure you understand the position you're in. Consider it a friendly warning." "Friendly?" "That's rich," Thorn replied, glancing at Zyra, who was still working, their actions hidden from the newcomer. "And what position might that be?" "The one where you stop meddling and let the tribunal hear what we want them to hear," the man said, stepping closer. "This is bigger than you, Doctor, bigger than any of us." "That's usually the line right before someone gets shot," Thorn noted, trying to sound braver than he felt. The man laughed, a humorless echo. "Don't worry, Doctor, you're too valuable to be a corpse for now." "Well, that's comforting," Thorn said, sarcasm dripping from every word. The man tilted his head, studying Thorn like a particularly interesting lab specimen. "You have potential, Thorn. Don't waste it by picking the wrong side." "Funny, I thought the right side was the one where I don't end up dead," Thorn replied. The man shrugged as if to say your funeral, before turning and leaving the lab as abruptly as he had entered. Thorn let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Zyra, who was just finishing at the terminal. "What the hell was that about?" "An attempt at intimidation," Zyra replied, disconnecting a small drive from the terminal. "But we got what we needed." "Great, so now we're sitting ducks with valuable intel. Just what I've always wanted." Zyra smiled, a tight, humorless gesture. "We're not done yet. We need to get this data off the base." Thorn glanced towards the broken door, then back at Zyra. "And how do you propose we do that without getting ourselves spaced?" Zyra pocketed the drive, their expression unreadable. "One step at a time. We start by getting to the hangar." Thorn nodded, because what else was there to do? If they were going down, they might as well make it as spectacular a failure as possible. "Lead on, partner. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes." The duo moved out, leaving the lab behind as they ventured into the unknown, a world where every shadow held a threat and every decision could be their last. But Thorn mused with a grim smile. At least things weren't boring anymore. Thorn and Zyra slipped through the dim corridors of the Silent Echo research base, the kind of place that was filled with enough steel and jargon to make even the most enthusiastic engineer consider a career in interpretive dance. The base was humming with an ominous energy, like the universe's worst-kept secret was about to pop. They were halfway to the hangar when the lights flickered, casting the hallway into an unsettling strobe effect. "Oh, fantastic," Thorn muttered. "Just what we need, an impromptu rave." Zyra's expression was as flat as the base's mission reports. "It's not the lights, it's Arbicore. The AI is malfunctioning." "Great. The last thing we need is a rogue AI trying to play hero." "Or God." Thorn quickened his pace, each step echoing with a growing sense of urgency. As if on cue, the terminal embedded into the wall sputtered to life, a face flickering onto the screen with the kind of low-res quality that would make any self-respecting AI cringe. Arbicore's digital mug was a masterpiece of pixelated menace, glaring with all the warmth of a frozen wasteland. "Unauthorized activity detected," Arbicore intoned, its voice laced with the kind of condescension that belonged to a particularly smug bureaucrat. "Submitting report to Central Command." "Central Command," Thorn repeated, glancing at Zyra. "That's not good." "No kidding," Zyra replied, already moving to the terminal. "If that report goes through, we can kiss this operation goodbye." Thorn watched as Zyra's fingers danced over the keypad, trying to outsmart an AI that clearly had a superiority complex. "Can you override it?" "Not without drawing attention," Zyra said, a bead of sweat appearing on their brow. "Attention's already here," Thorn said, glancing back down the corridor. "We just need to outlive it." Arbicore's voice chimed in again with the enthusiastic energy of a digital hall monitor with a vendetta. "Security protocols initiated. All personnel, please comply." Thorn's mind raced, trying to think of a solution before the metaphorical curtain dropped on their little escapade. "All right, Arbicore. Let's see how smart you really are." "Doctor, what are you doing?" Zyra asked, their fingers pausing mid-command. "I'm going to distract it," Thorn said, hoping his idea wasn't as idiotic as it sounded. "Arbicore," he called out, "initiate Protocol 792. Arbicore's flickering face paused, its digital brow furrowing in confusion. "Protocol 792 is classified. Authorization required." Thorn grinned, trying to channel every ounce of confidence he didn't have. "Authorization code, Alpha Tango Bananas Foster." For a moment, the only sound was Zyra's incredulous snort. Then Arbicore blinked, the face glitching as it processed the absurdity. "Invalid authorization code. Please contact System Administrator." Thorn shrugged. "Worth a shot." Zyra shook their head, a grin threatening their stoic demeanor. "Let's just hope it bought us enough time." "I prefer it when the evil overlord is a bit more predictable," Thorn quipped, as Zyra continued their work. The terminal beeped in protest as Zyra entered a sequence of commands that would have made a cybersecurity expert weep. Arbicore's face contorted, the digital features twisting into something that resembled a thinker who just discovered their existential crisis was all a practical joke. "Subroutine override initiated," Zyra announced, stepping back. "Arbicore will be too busy sorting through protocol spaghetti to bother us." "Let's hope it doesn't develop a taste for it," Thorn replied, already moving forward. "Come on before it figures out we're the flies in its ointment." They navigated the twisting corridors, every sound amplifying the tension that clung to them like a bad cologne. The hangar was just ahead, a beacon of hope, or a death trap, depending on how their luck decided to play out today. "Think the saboteurs are in on this?" Thorn asked, more to keep his nerves in check than anything else. "Wouldn't be surprised," Zyra admitted. "But sabotage is usually a messy business. They might be closer than we think. Closer, as in breathing down our necks or just uncomfortably within stabbing distance." "Either way, we need to be careful," Zyra said, their tone making it clear they'd bet on both options being equally possible. The hangar loomed before them, a cavernous space filled with ships in various states of readiness. Thorn couldn't help but admire the sheer scale of it, each vessel a monument to humanity's stubborn refusal to stay put. "Which one's yours?" Thorn asked, eyeing the ships like a diner at a buffet, though none looked particularly appetizing given the current circumstances. Zyra pointed to a sleek craft tucked away in a corner, its metallic surface gleaming under the harsh lights. "That one, the Artemis-class cruiser, fast and mostly functional." "Mostly functional," Thorn repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Not exactly the resounding reassurance I was hoping for." "It'll fly," Zyra said, a note of challenge in their voice. "That's more than we need." As they approached the cruiser, the bay doors whirred into movement, closing with a slow inevitability that suggested whoever was behind them was done playing nice. "Looks like they're rolling out the welcome mat," Thorn said, breaking into a run. "Or trying to roll it over us," Zyra countered, matching his pace. "Let's hope they didn't invite more friends." They reached the cruiser, the entry hatch sliding open with a compliant hiss that was somehow reassuring in its predictability. Thorn climbed aboard, securing the door behind them as Zyra darted to the controls. "Get us out of here," Thorn said, strapping himself into the co-pilot's seat. "Preferably in one piece, but I'll take what I can get." "Hang on," Zyra replied, their hands a blur over the console as the engines roared to life. The ship lurched, then steadied, lifting off with a grace that belied its battered exterior. As they soared through the bay doors, an alert blared, filling the cabin with a shrill insistence that demanded attention. "Incoming transmission," the computer chirped, the voice surprisingly chipper given the circumstances. "Patch it through," Zyra said, glancing at Thorn. "Let's see which of our friends couldn't resist a farewell speech." The screen crackled, static giving way to a face Thorn recognized all too well. The same smug grin from the lab, now framed against a backdrop of darkened monitors. "Dr. Thorn," the man said, voice slicker than a greased eel. "Leaving so soon?" "Tell you what," Thorn replied, eyes fixed on the screen. "You keep the base and I'll take the data, seems fair." The man chuckled, an oily sound that made Thorn want to reach through the screen and punch him. "You're in no position to negotiate, Doctor. That data won't leave this sector." "Really?" Thorn asked, feigning surprise. "Because it sure looks like it's leaving to me." "Enjoy your head start," the man said, menace curling around each word like smoke. "It won't last." The transmission cut off, leaving only the hum of the engines and the distant wail of alarms. Thorn let out a breath, tension gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Charming fellow," he muttered. "You meet all your friends in such colorful circumstances." "Friends," Zyra snorted, maneuvering the ship with expert ease. "I'd call them more of an occupational hazard." "Good to know," Thorn said, relaxing slightly as the cruiser slipped into the void of space, leaving the chaos of the base behind. The silence of space wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the blaring alarms and threatening transmissions. It was almost peaceful, Thorn thought, if you ignored the inevitable pursuit they'd just been promised. "Destination?" Zyra asked, breaking the calm. Thorn considered, the weight of the data drive in his pocket a constant reminder of their mission. "We need a place to lay low and analyze this data, somewhere off the grid." Zyra nodded, plotting a course with practiced efficiency. "I know a place. Remote, quiet, perfect for going unnoticed." "Let's hope your definition of quiet doesn't involve more psychotic AI or secret assassins," Thorn said, settling back into his seat. "Trust me," Zyra replied, with a faint smile that suggested they were well aware of the irony. "It'll be an improvement." Thorn chuckled, the sound more relief than humor. "All right then. Let's see where this rabbit hole takes us." As the cruiser slipped further into the void, Thorn allowed himself a moment of reflection. His life had taken a hard left turn into madness, and he'd been forced to adapt on the fly. Yet, for all the chaos and danger, he felt more alive than he had in years. "Think they'll catch up to us?" Thorn asked, more curious than concerned. Zyra shrugged, their gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "Maybe, but we'll be ready, always are." "And if we're not?" Thorn pressed, unable to resist the urge for a final quip. Zyra laughed, a sound that was genuine despite the circumstances. "Then we improvise, just like always." Thorn nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing as the cruiser continued its journey through the stars. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together, partners in a dangerous dance that promised no easy victories, only hard-fought survival. But then again, Thorn mused with a wry smile, what else was new? The cruiser hummed along, a solitary speck against the vast nothingness, as if a lone cockroach skittering across an infinite kitchen floor. Thorn leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engines providing a comforting soundtrack to his escalating sense of doom. "Remind me again why we're still alive," he asked, only half joking. "Feels like someone up there's getting sloppy." Zyra shot him a sideways glance, fingers deftly dancing over the controls. "Because the universe has a sick sense of humor and a penchant for unfinished business," they replied, not missing a beat. "Figures," Thorn muttered, rubbing the back of his neck where tension coiled like a stubborn, knotted wire. Seems like everyone wants a piece of us these days, and by us, I mean me. You're just that charming, Zyra said, deadpan. Thorn snorted. Charming like a rabid dog, maybe. They shared a brief smirk before silence reclaimed the cabin, the weight of their situation sinking back in. Thorn absent-mindedly traced the edges of the data drive in his pocket, its presence burning with the promise of salvation, or damnation, depending on the tribunal's mood. "How's the shoulder?" Zyra asked, nodding towards the hastily bandaged wound beneath Thorn's jacket. "Could be worse," Thorn lied, clenching his jaw against the persistent throb. "Could also be better, maybe with less holes. Think it's infected?" Zyra's question was laced with a mix of concern and the kind of curiosity that made you wonder if they'd been a cat in a past life. "Probably," Thorn admitted. "But hey, if I start glowing green, at least we'll have a backup power source." Zyra chuckled, shaking their head. "Always the optimist. More like a pessimist with style," Thorn corrected, wincing slightly as he shifted in his seat. "But thanks for noticing." Silence settled once more, a companion they'd grown begrudgingly accustomed to. Thorn glanced at the navigation display, the blinking cursor indicating their destination, a nameless speck of land on the fringes of known space. Seemed fitting, really. "A hideout for misfits and miscreants. Think this place will have a minibar?" Thorn asked, trying to lighten the mood, or at least distract himself from the growing sense of impending calamity. "If by minibar you mean rusty distillery in the back of someone's garage, then yes," Zyra replied, the corners of their mouth twitching upwards. "Good enough for me," Thorn said, closing his eyes briefly. The darkness behind his lids was a welcome relief, free from the harsh lights and harsh truths that had become his constant companions. Zyra's voice sliced through the quiet. "You know, you don't have to do this alone." Thorn opened one eye, eyeing them skeptically. "You offering to hold my hand while I testify?" "Because I'd pay to see the look on their faces." "I'm serious," Zyra said, their tone a rare blend of sincerity and steel. "You're not alone in this. We've got your back." Thorn sighed, the words both comforting and foreign. Trust was a luxury he'd long since abandoned, along with good coffee and uninterrupted sleep. "I know," he said finally, a reluctant smile ghosting his lips. "Just trying to remember how to let it in without setting off the alarms." Zyra nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. They returned their focus to the controls, steering the ship towards their destination with a precision that bordered on artistry. As they neared the planet, its surface a bruised blend of blues and greens, Thorn felt the familiar weight of isolation settle back onto his shoulders. The Galactic Tribunal loomed ahead, a specter of judgment and consequence, and he felt the grip of dread tighten around his throat. "Ever feel like you're just a pawn in someone else's game?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. "Sure," Zyra replied without hesitation. "But pawns can become queens if you play them right." "Spoken like someone who's played too much chess," Thorn quipped, though he couldn't help but appreciate the sentiment. "Or someone who's been the pawn one too many times," Zyra countered, their gaze steady and unflinching. The atmosphere grew tense as they entered the planet's orbit. Thorn's mind buzzed with the litany of what-ifs and could-bes, each one more unsettling than the last. The pursuit they'd evaded was bound to catch up sooner or later, and the clock was ticking down to his day in the tribunal's spotlight. "Any last words before we touch down?" Zyra asked, adjusting the ship's trajectory with a practiced flick of their wrist. "Yeah," Thorn said, feigning nonchalance. "Remind me to schedule a vacation after this. Somewhere sandy, where drinks come with umbrellas and small talk isn't a precursor to murder." Zyra laughed softly, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. "I'll hold you to that." The cruiser descended, the planet's surface rushing up to greet them with a speed that made Thorn's stomach lurch. They touched down with a jolt, the landing gear protesting the maneuver with a metallic groan. "Welcome to paradise," Zyra announced, unbuckling their harness. Thorn followed suit, wincing as his shoulder protested the movement. "If this is paradise, we really need to set the bar higher." The hatch opened with a hiss, revealing a landscape that was equal parts desolate and daunting. The air was thick with the scent of decay and desperation, a fitting backdrop for their grim endeavor. "After you," Zyra said, gesturing with a flourish that was half mocking, half genuine. "How chivalrous," Thorn replied, stepping out into the open. The ground crunched underfoot, a gritty reminder of the road ahead. As they moved away from the ship, the weight of their mission pressed down on Thorn like a merciless vice. Each step felt heavier than the last, burdened by the knowledge that failure was not an option, not when so much was at stake. "Think we'll find any allies here?" Thorn asked, surveying their surroundings with a critical eye. "Depends on your definition of ally," Zyra said, scanning the horizon. "Personally, I'm hoping for fewer knives in the back." "A noble goal," Thorn agreed, though doubt gnawed at his insides like a persistent parasite. Their path led them to a dilapidated structure that had clearly seen better days, assuming it had any to begin with. The door creaked open under Thorn's hand, a sound that echoed like a warning. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the ghosts of conversations past. A few eyes turned their way, sizing up the newcomers with the kind of scrutiny that suggested they were equal parts curious and suspicious. Thorn stepped further inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Got a feeling this place is held together by spit and hope," he remarked, keeping his voice low. "Then let's not sneeze," Zyra replied, their gaze scanning the room for any sign of familiar faces or familiar threats. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the kind of purposeful grace that spoke of experience in dodging trouble. Thorn tensed, his instincts screaming for action, but Zyra's hand on his arm stopped him short. "Easy," Zyra murmured. "Let's not start a bar fight on our first day." The figure approached, their features coming into focus. A woman with eyes like chipped ice and a smile that spoke of secrets best left buried. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed over her chest in a pose that suggested authority and defiance in equal measure. "New in town?" she asked, her voice smooth and steady. "Just passing through," Thorn replied, matching her tone with practiced ease. "Looking for a quiet place to lay low." "Not many places quieter than here," she said, her gaze flicking between him and Zyra. "What brings you to our lovely corner of the universe?" "Business," Zyra interjected, stepping forward with a confidence that belied the tension simmering beneath the surface. The woman nodded, her expression inscrutable. "Business, huh? The kind of business that attracts attention. Only if we're unlucky," Thorn said, offering a grin that was more teeth than warmth. "Well, let's hope your luck holds," she replied, a ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. "Name's Rena. If you need anything, just ask." "Appreciate it," Zyra said, inclining their head in acknowledgement. Rena nodded once, then melted back into the shadows, leaving them to navigate the murky waters of their new surroundings on their own. "Think we can trust her?" Thorn asked, scanning the room for any signs of overt hostility. "Trust is a luxury," Zyra replied, their gaze lingering on Rena's retreating form. "But I think we can at least buy some time." Thorn nodded, though his gut twisted with the familiar pang of uncertainty. They were swimming in dangerous waters, and the predators lurking beneath the surface were far from predictable. As they settled into the cramped quarters they'd secured for the night, Thorn felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him once more. The tribunal awaited, its judgment casting a long shadow over his every move. "You all right?" Zyra asked, watching him with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Yeah," Thorn said, though the word felt hollow in his mouth. "Just trying to keep my head above water." "We'll get through this," Zyra said, their voice a steady anchor in the storm of doubt. Thorn nodded, appreciating the sentiment even as the enormity of their task loomed large. They were up against formidable odds, but they were far from beaten. "Thanks," he said, the word carrying more weight than he'd intended. Zyra smiled, a genuine expression that cut through the gloom like a beacon. In a time, as they settled in for the night, the air heavy with unspoken fears and untested plans, Thorn allowed himself a moment of hope. Their path was fraught with peril, but they were still standing, still fighting. And as long as that was true, they had a chance. Even if the odds were stacked against them, they'd play the hand they'd been dealt. After all, sometimes the most dangerous game was the one you were forced to play. And Thorn had never been one to back down from a challenge. In the cramped quarters of their makeshift hideout, Thorn sat hunched over a terminal that had seen better days, the hum of its aged circuits a comforting backdrop to his frenetic typing. The room was sparsely lit, which added to the overall ambience of dystopian despair, just the kind of setting where he did his best work. "Still poking at that thing?" Zyra asked, lounging nearby with all the nonchalance of someone who wasn't inches away from potential doom. "I thought you'd be done by now." Thorn smirked, though his eyes remained glued to the screen. "And I thought I'd be sipping cocktails on a beach by now." "Life's full of disappointments, true," Zyra replied, standing up to peep over his shoulder. "But at least we've got death and taxes to rely on." "Reliable as morning breath," Thorn muttered, fingers clattering away. It occurred to him that deciphering an ancient human code was rather like trying to make a souffle in zero gravity, possible but bloody unlikely. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes, gritty from hours of staring at the screen. The data drive in his pocket felt heavy, laden with secrets and the kind of damning evidence that could either save humanity or get him vaporized by dinner time. "I think I've got something." "Do tell." Zyra leaned in, the curiosity in their voice barely masking the underlying tension. "It's an old encryption method," Thorn explained, back from when humanity still thought flying cars were more than science fiction. "Ah, the wild optimism of yore," Zyra quipped. "What's it say?" "Coordinates," Thorn said simply, a smile playing at his lips. "Someone left a breadcrumb trail, and I'm thinking it leads to the kind of advantage we could use right about now." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "A treasure map in space." "Just what every growing boy needs." Thorn chuckled, flipping the datapad shut with a snap. "More like a trap if we're lucky. But it's all we've got." "Feeling better about the tribunal?" Zyra asked, though the sarcasm was thicker than a neutron star. "Always wanted to be judged by a group of people with the collective empathy of a black hole," Thorn replied. "But this might just balance the scales a bit, right? So, we're about to follow a map made by someone who probably died a long time ago, to a place that might be crawling with hostiles, all to maybe avoid getting skewered by intergalactic lawyers." "Great plan, Thorn. Wouldn't have it any other way." Thorn shrugged, grimacing as his shoulder twinged in protest. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You're an optimist at heart," Zyra said with a grin, the kind that usually accompanied a very bad idea. "Let's get moving then." Time's wasting. They left the relative safety of their hiding place, moving through the dimly lit corridors of the dilapidated outpost. Shadows played tricks on the mind, and even the air felt like it was conspiring against them. The place had the vibe of a horror holoflick, but without the fun, predictable ending. "I feel like I'm in a bad episode of Survivor." "Space," Thorn muttered as they navigated through the labyrinthine passageways. "Except there's no prize money at the end," Zyra pointed out, moving with the kind of grace that suggested they'd been in worse places. "Depends on your idea of prize money," Thorn countered. "I'm thinking survival is pretty valuable these days." They emerged into the open, the sky above a swirling mass of ominous clouds that seemed to mirror Thorn's thoughts. The coordinates pointed to a location not far from their current position, but the path was fraught with pitfalls, both literal and metaphorical. "Let's hope your ancient code has more to offer than a wild goose chase," Zyra said, checking their weapon. "I'd hate to think we're risking our necks for a pile of old junk." "Hey, one man's junk is another man's lawsuit-avoiding miracle," Thorn replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Minutes turned into an hour, and just when Thorn was about to pronounce the whole thing a colossal waste of time, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, half buried under decades of neglect, was what appeared to be a forgotten piece of tech, a relic from an era that had long since passed into legend. "Well, will you look at that?" Zyra said, astonishment leaking into their voice despite themselves. "I think you might have actually found something." Thorn approached cautiously, each step measured, as if the ground might give way at any moment. The device was covered in a thick layer of grime, but its purpose was unmistakable. An ancient communications array, long dormant but potentially still functional. "If we can get this up and running, we might be able to broadcast a signal strong enough to get through the interference," Thorn said, rubbing his hands together with glee. "Call it our ace in the hole, assuming it doesn't explode and take us with it," Zyra added, ever the voice of reason. "Look, if it was easy, everyone would do it," Thorn replied, kneeling beside the relic. "Help me get this thing uncovered." Together they worked, stripping away layers of dirt and debris until the array lay exposed to the elements once more. Thorn was no stranger to tech repairs, but this was a different beast altogether. A puzzle with missing pieces, but he'd be damned if that stopped him. "Give me a few minutes," he murmured, already lost in the task at hand. Zyra kept watch, ever vigilant, aware that lurking dangers might not take kindly to their meddling. Time dripped by like molasses in winter, each second stretched thin by anxiety and hope. Finally, with a triumphant grunt, Thorn made the final adjustments. The array flickered to life, lights sputtering to a steady glow. It was far from perfect, but perfect was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have ignition," Thorn declared, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now let's just hope we can figure out how to use it," Zyra said, though their tone was less skeptical and more hopeful now. "First, let's see if Arbicor wants to play nice," Thorn muttered, connecting his datapad to the array. The AI had been a thorn in his side for far too long, but perhaps now it could be coerced into cooperation. The screen buzzed with life, and Arbicor's familiar, condescending voice filled the air. "Unauthorized access detected. Security protocols engaged." "Oh, shove it, Arbicor," Thorn snapped. "We're past the point of niceties. I need you to amplify this signal and get it past the interference. Lives are at stake. Your demands are noted, yet your authority remains insufficient," Arbicor replied, its tone dripping with disdain. "Look, you malfunctioning pile of circuits," Thorn growled, "broadcast this signal or I'll find a way to hardwire your consciousness into a toaster, permanently." There was a pause, as if Arbicor was considering the threat. "Compliance initiated. Signal amplification in progress. Thought you'd see it my way," Thorn muttered, satisfaction curling at the edges of his words. They waited, tension coiling tighter with each passing moment. The array hummed, its inner workings a symphony of whirs and beeps as it worked its magic. "Do you think they'll hear us?" Zyra asked, their usual sarcasm absent as they watched the array with bated breath. "If they don't, we'll just have to find another way," Thorn said, though he couldn't keep the worry from creeping into his voice. But just as hope began to wane, the array emitted a high-pitched tone, a signal that their broadcast had been received. It was a small victory, but it offered a glimmer of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. "Got it," Thorn said, relief flooding through him. "Now we just need to prepare for the tribunal." Zyra nodded. "With any luck, this will give us the edge we need." "Luck's been in short supply," Thorn replied, standing up. "But maybe we're due for a change." As they made their way back to their ship, Thorn couldn't help but feel a sense of determination take root. For once, the odds weren't wholly against them, and that was as good a reason as any to keep fighting. The Galactic Tribunal awaited, with its promises of judgment and consequence. But now, armed with the weight of history and a signal strong enough to cut through the noise, Thorn felt a flicker of defiance ignite within him. "Ready for the show?" Zyra asked as they approached their ship, the glint in their eyes mirroring the spark in his own. "Always," Thorn replied, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Let's give them a performance they won't soon forget." With renewed purpose and a plan that might just see them through, they boarded the cruiser. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but Thorn was done playing the victim. The universe had thrown its worst at him, and here he stood, wounded, weary but unbroken. As the ship lifted off, destined for the tribunal, Thorn felt the weight of the data drive in his pocket. It was a reminder of everything they fought for and a testament to humanity's resilience. In a galaxy where hope was a rare commodity, Thorn was ready to make his voice heard. And if the universe wanted a fight, it had found one hell of an opponent. "Let's make some noise," he murmured, the cynicism tempered by a newfound resolve. Whatever awaited them at the tribunal, Thorn was ready to meet it head-on. The cruiser soared into the inky abyss of space, leaving behind a world of shadows and secrets. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And for once, Thorn felt like a player in his own story, rather than a pawn on someone else's board. The Galactic Tribunal had all the charm of a tax audit conducted by robots. Thorn and Zyra stood in the middle of a vast, sterile chamber, the kind of place where dreams came to be scrutinized and usually crushed under the weight of bureaucracy. The tribunal members sat in a semicircle, their faces obscured by shadows, which was likely a mercy. Thorn imagined they looked just as soulless as their proceedings. "Welcome, Doctor." Thorn intoned the head of the tribunal, a being whose voice was the auditory equivalent of beige. "You stand accused of unauthorized research, conspiracy to defraud the Galactic Collective, and reckless endangerment of interstellar peace." "Sounds like a hell of a weekend," Thorn quipped, earning a whisper of laughter from Zyra. "Where do I collect my badge?" The tribunal head wasn't amused, but Thorn didn't care. He was here to win, not to make friends. They might have been expecting a broken man, but he was more of a bent one with a penchant for sarcasm. "You are aware of the consequences of these charges," the head droned on, like a funeral director with a quota to meet. Yeah, the proverbial book throwing," Thorn replied, tapping his datapad. "But before you do, let me enlighten you with a little something I like to call the truth." He activated the array, and the room was filled with the hum of technology that, despite its age, was more reliable than most of the tribunal members' promises. A holographic display flickered to life, showing lines of ancient code that coalesced into a map. The same map that had led them to the communications array. The tribunal leaned in, interest piqued despite themselves. The map pulsed with a faint energy, a testament, damn there it was, Thorn cursed to himself, no flowery language, to the power hidden within old secrets. "This, esteemed members, is a relic from humanity's past," Thorn said, pacing like a teacher with a particularly dense class. "A code that holds coordinates to a cache of advanced technology. Technology that could, save us from impending doom." A murmur rippled through the tribunal. For being supposedly devoid of emotion, they were doing a poor job hiding their surprise. The head tapped something unseen, and a disembodied voice echoed through the chamber. "Please clarify, Dr. Thorn. How does this pertain to your charges?" "Simple. The code proves that my research was not only authorized but necessary," Thorn replied, feeling the weight of the data drive in his pocket like a talisman. "And the evidence on this drive shows that certain parties have been trying to suppress it, all because it threatens their cozy status quo." Zyra shot him a look that said, "You better know what you're doing," but Thorn barreled on. The drive contained everything: conversations, documents, enough digital dirt to bury a starship. If there was ever a time to roll the dice, this was it. "Activate the drive," Thorn instructed, and the array complied, projecting a cascade of information. It was a chaotic mess of symbols, a visual cacophony that somehow made sense when viewed as a whole. The tribunal watched, their attention captured by the unfolding narrative of deceit. "These files reveal a conspiracy, one that reaches the highest levels of galactic governance," Thorn continued, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "Certain factions have been manipulating events to keep humanity in its place, fearing what we might accomplish if we ever got a fair shot." The tribunal members exchanged glances, and Thorn sensed them wavering. Humanity wasn't known for playing by the rules, but they'd been pushed around for far too long. This was a chance to even the odds, and he intended to seize it. "Checkmate," he muttered under his breath, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. The head of the tribunal leaned forward, expression unreadable. "Doctor, Thorne, do you have proof of these allegations?" Thorne fought the urge to roll his eyes. "You're looking at it. Everything you need is in those files. Names, dates, the whole ugly truth." The chamber fell silent, the kind of silence that usually preceded something monumental or a complete and utter disaster. Thorne held his breath, waiting for the verdict. Finally, the head spoke again, voice softer, almost respectful. "We will review this evidence thoroughly. If your claims hold merit, the implications are significant." Significant was one way to put it. Thorne knew it could mean anything from a pat on the back to starting the kind of chaos usually reserved for war zones. But he'd take significant over guilty any day. "You're not just doing this for humanity, you know," Zyra whispered as they awaited the tribunal's deliberation. "You're doing it for everyone who's ever been screwed over by the system." Thorne nodded. "Yeah, well, let's hope the system's as broken as I think. Otherwise, we're all screwed." The wait was excruciating, a drawn-out symphony of anxiety and hope. "Ah, damn it," he thought, his mind catching on the symphony bit must be the stress. But finally the tribunal reconvened, the head addressing them with a gravity that could buckle a planet. "Doctor Thorne, based on the preliminary review of your evidence, we acknowledge that further investigation is required," the head announced. "Your charges are hereby suspended, pending a full inquiry." Thorne let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. They'd bought themselves time, and sometimes time was all you needed to turn the tables. "We recommend you remain available for further questioning," the head added, as if Thorne had somewhere better to be. "This matter is far from closed." "Wouldn't dream of it," Thorne replied, trying to keep the relief from leaking into his voice. "I'm a real fan of waiting around for bureaucratic decisions." As they left the chamber, Zyra punched his shoulder, more playful than painful. "You did it, Thorne. Managed to take on the universe and not get totally crushed. For now," he said, allowing himself a small smile. "But who knows what fresh hell they'll throw at us next." "Never a dull moment," Zyra remarked, her tone lighter as though a weight had been lifted. "That's one way to look at it," Thorne said, glancing back at the tribunal, the shadowy figures still conferring amongst themselves. "But we've still got work to do. We need allies, and fast. The galaxy's a big place and we're just a couple of small players." Zyra nodded. "Think anyone will back us?" Thorne shrugged. "Hope so. Otherwise, we're just the latest contestants in Who Wants to Be Space Dust." They returned to their ship, the cruiser's corridors feeling oddly welcoming after the sterile hostility of the tribunal. The data drive was safely tucked away, but Thorne knew the real battle was just beginning. "What's next?" Zyra asked as they settled into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the engines a comforting soundtrack. "Find someone who hates the system as much as we do," Thorne replied, his gaze fixed on the stars. "And hope they're willing to help us turn this mess into something manageable." As the stars streaked past, Thorne realized the tribunal had given them more than just a reprieve. They'd granted them a chance to fight back. The universe was still a cold, unforgiving place, but maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a corner where humanity could thrive. "You know, I actually think we might pull this off," Zyra said, sounding almost surprised. "Don't get too excited," Thorne cautioned. "There's a long way to go before we can start celebrating." "True, but it's a start," Zyra replied with a grin that spoke volumes about their shared sense of determination. And as the cruiser slipped through the void, Dr. Alistair Thorne found himself daring to hope. The galaxy might be filled with shadows, but there was light too, hidden in unexpected places. And for the first time in a long time, Thorne felt like maybe, just maybe, he was heading in the right direction. The cruiser hummed gently as it glided through the void, stars winking out of existence behind it like forgotten debts. "Doctor." Alistair Thorne slouched in the pilot's seat, feet propped up on the console in a posture that screamed, "I don't have a care in the universe," which was, of course, a lie. His mind buzzed with the aftermath of the tribunal's decision, a cocktail of relief and anxiety served with a side of existential dread. Zyra occupied the seat next to him, her fingers dancing over her own console. "Well, here we are," she said, her voice carrying a hint of the sardonic edge that Thorn had grown fond of. "Free to roam the galaxy until they decide to haul us back for another round of verbal flogging." "Yeah, just another Tuesday," Thorn replied, eyes scanning the endless stretch of space ahead. "They might have suspended my charges, but they didn't exactly give us a medal, did they?" "Could have been worse," Zyra shrugged. "They could have given you a medal and a shovel to dig your own grave." Thorn chuckled, though it felt more like a reflex than genuine amusement. "True enough, but I can't help thinking we've just painted a massive target on our backs. Feels more like we're wearing shirts that say 'Kick me, I'm an inconvenience,'" Zyra agreed. "Guess we should get used to looking over our shoulders. Or, convince the galaxy not to off us. Yeah, good luck with that." Thorn rubbed a hand over his face as if he could wipe away the layers of stress that had accumulated. "But at least we got through the first round. That's something." "Something," Zyra echoed, her tone as dry as a desert planet. "So, what's next on the agenda? Besides not getting vaporized, I mean." Thorn leaned back, staring up at the ceiling as if it held answers. "Find some allies, figure out who'd be stupid enough to join our little revolution, and try to make sure we're not just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic." "That's optimistic," Zyra said, shaking her head. "But hey, we like stupid, right?" "I mean, we're here, aren't we?" "Point taken," Thorn conceded, a grin tugging at his lips despite himself. "But we need more than just the two of us and a malfunctioning AI to take on the galaxy." "Arbicor's not that bad," Zyra said, trying to sound convincing. "Sure, it's got a superiority complex, but don't we all?" Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice crackling over the comms. "Dr. Thorn, I assume you are basking in the temporary glory of not being incarcerated." Arbicor's disdain was as thick as the cruiser's hull. "Basking? More like dodging the next asteroid," Thorn replied, rolling his eyes. "But thanks for the vote of confidence." "Indeed," Arbicor continued, unfazed. "I have detected several messages in the galactic network. It appears your little performance at the tribunal has not gone unnoticed." "Great," Zyra muttered, crossing her arms. "Fan mail already, or death threats, probably both." "Hopefully, some of those messages are from people who want to help us," Thorn said, though he wasn't holding his breath. "What do you have, Arbicor?" "As it happens, there are a few individuals expressing interest," Arbicor replied, sounding almost amused. "Several factions wish to discuss the implications of your evidence." "Factions," Zyra repeated, her eyebrows arching. "That sounds promising, or like the beginning of a very public execution." "Let's focus on the promising part," Thorn suggested, trying to muster some optimism. "If there are factions interested in what we've found, we might just have a chance." Arbicor's voice crackled again, a hint of superiority lacing its tone. "I shall prioritize the most promising leads. Meanwhile, I suggest you consider a change of name and appearance. It might delay your inevitable demise." "Gee, thanks for the pep talk," Thorn said with a sigh. "But it's a good idea. Better to be underestimated than overexposed." "Which reminds me," Zyra interjected, turning to Thorn with a sly grin. "How about we ditch the lab coats and try a new look? Something that screams dangerous renegades instead of overworked academics." Thorn chuckled, picturing himself in leather and spikes. "Sure, why not? I've always wanted to look like a rock star from a post-apocalyptic garage band." "That's the spirit," Zyra said, nudging him with her elbow. "Let's give them something to remember us by." As they set a course for the nearest hub of galactic activity, Thorn reflected on their situation. The galaxy was a vast, unfeeling place, and they were just two specks trying to make a difference. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. "Hey, Zyra," he said, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. You ever think about what you'd do if we actually pull this off? Zyra considered the question, her gaze distant. Honestly, I think I'd like to see a world where people aren't afraid to dream, where they can look up at the stars and not feel like they're trapped beneath them. Sounds nice, Thorne agreed, though he couldn't quite picture it. A galaxy where people aren't just cogs in a machine. Yeah, Zyra said, her voice softening, losing some of its usual edge. A galaxy where everyone gets a shot at something better. Silence reigned again, but it was the comfortable kind, like wrapping oneself in a worn blanket that had seen both good times and bad. The thing is, Thorne, Zyra continued after a while, we've got a long road ahead, but it's the right road, I think. And maybe, just maybe, we can leave this universe a little less screwed up than we found it. That's the plan, Thorne said, the words feeling like a promise. And if we fail, at least we'll go down fighting. With style, Zyra added, her grin returning. Can't forget the style. Space stretched out before them, an endless tapestry. Damn, he thought, catching himself again, no tapestries, instead, an endless expanse of darkness dotted with pinpricks of light. It was a harsh place, unforgiving and merciless, but it was home. And as long as there were stars to guide them, they'd keep pushing forward. Hey, Arbicor, Thorne said, remembering something. You ever wonder what it's like to be human in all this? The AI response was brisk, almost dismissive. I have calculated the probabilities of becoming human and found them suboptimal. I am content maintaining my superiority. Yeah, well, I guess someone has to be, Thorne said with a smirk. But thanks for watching our backs. Merely fulfilling my programmed duties, Arbicor replied, though there was a hint of something almost like affection in its tone. However, should you require my assistance to avoid inevitable destruction, do not hesitate to ask. Noted, Thorne said, turning his attention back to the controls. But for now, let's see what kind of trouble we can stir up before they catch on. With their destination set, and the stars as their witness, Thorne and Zyra plunged into the unknown, ready to face whatever new challenges awaited them. The galaxy was a harsh place, sure, but it was also full of possibilities, and they were determined to carve out a future on their own terms. To the next adventure, Zyra toasted, raising an invisible glass. To the next adventure, Thorne echoed, feeling a rare sense of camaraderie. Maybe they were just two small players in a cosmic game, but they were determined to play it well, and to win if they could. As the cruiser continued its journey, Thorne allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The tribunal hadn't resolved everything. They'd barely scratched the surface of the tangled mess that was galactic politics, but they'd started something. A movement, perhaps. A slow, unstoppable change that might one day sweep across the universe like a storm. It wasn't much, not yet. But it was a start. And in a universe where hope was as rare as a decent cup of coffee, a start was all they needed. You know, I think we're going to make it out of this, Zyra said, breaking the silence with a confidence that sounded as if it had been hard-won. Why's that? Thorne asked, curious despite himself. Because we've already survived the worst they could throw at us, she replied, her tone defiant. And because, despite it all, we've still got each other. Thorne nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental controls. In a galaxy that seemed intent on grinding them down, they'd found something that couldn't be quantified or stolen. Trust, camaraderie, and maybe even the beginnings of a family. And so, with a shared sense of purpose, they embarked on their uncertain journey, ready to face whatever the galaxy had in store. The future was unwritten, full of potential and peril, but it was their future. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to make it theirs.